In the first video, we covered the basics of the Fair Labor Standards Act, including employee versus independent contractor, minimum wage, and overtime requirements. Now we are going to be covering some of the most common exemptions, as well as special rules for law enforcement and firefighting employees. The executive exemption applies to someone whose primary duty is managing the enterprise or a department or subdivision of the enterprise. This would be department directors and others that are in charge of discrete areas of the employer's operation. The executive must customarily and regularly direct the work of at least 2 employees and either have the authority to hire or fire, or the employee's suggestions and recommendations as to the hiring, firing, or other change of status must be given particular weight. The administrative exemption. An administrator's primary duty is performance of office or non-manual work directly related to the management or general business operations of the employer. Administrative work is contrasted with production work. Administrators must also exercise discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance. Professionals. Professionals are those who perform work requiring knowledge of an advanced type in a field of science or learning customarily acquired by prolonged, specialized intellectual instruction or study, or work as a computer systems analyst, computer programmer, software engineer, or other similarly skilled worker in the computer field, and their work requires consistent exercise of discretion and judgment. The work requiring knowledge of an advanced type in a field of science or learning is traditionally limited to professions such as doctors, lawyers, and CPAs. You will notice that with all 3 of these exemptions, the exercise of discretion and independent judgment is a necessary component. Highly compensated employees. Currently, the amount of salary required to be a highly compensated employee is $100,000 per year. This will change on December 1st, 2016. The new amount is $134,004 per year. This salary amount is derived and indexed to the 90th percentile of full-time salaried workers nationally and will be reset every 3 years starting in 2020. A highly compensated employee's primary duty is office or non-manual work, and the employee must otherwise qualify under a test for exemption as executive, administrative, or professional employee. Addressing the new salary amount for exemption. If multiple employees hold the same position, but some are paid on a salary basis an amount over the threshold for exemption due to longevity or merit increases, and others make less, what should the employer do? The employer should first examine whether the employees are eligible for exemption based on the actual job duties performed. Job titles do not matter. Eligibility for exemption is based on what each individual employee actually does. Second, if all of the employees under consideration perform job duties eligible for exemption and are paid on a salary basis, the employer must treat those who do not earn the salary amount required for exemption as non-exempt employees, or raise the salary of those employees to the exemption threshold amount. Another option is for the employer to treat all employees performing those job duties as eligible for overtime, even though some could be exempt. Finally, the employer could treat some of the employees as exempt and some as non-exempt based on whether they receive a salary amount eligible for exemption. A salaried employee treated as exempt does not make at least $47,476 annually, but regularly works more than 40 hours per week. What can the employer do? First, the employer should see if the actual job duties qualify the employee as eligible for overtime exemption. If not, pay the employee overtime for all hours over 40 actually worked in a work week. If all tests for exemption are met except for the salary amount, the employer may raise the salary to the exemption threshold and treat the employee as exempt from overtime. Another option is for the employer to hire an additional employee so that the existing employee is not required to work over 40 hours in a work week. According to the United States Department of Labor, in response to the new overtime rule, employers can pay time and a half for overtime work, raise employees' salaries above the new threshold, limit workers' hours to 40 per week, or some combination of the above. Special rules with regard to law enforcement employees. A law enforcement employee is a member of a government body empowered to enforce laws who has the power to arrest and has received law enforcement training. Law enforcement employees do not include civilian employees of law enforcement agencies. Moreover, if your city does not have at least 5 full or part-time law enforcement employees, these employees are exempt from the overtime requirement, but not the minimum wage requirement. This means the employer does not have to pay them overtime. The employer may elect to pay them overtime, but it is not required by federal law. For calculating overtime, the work week may be different from the pay period. This is particularly true for employees in the law enforcement and firefighting sector, as they traditionally do not work 8-hour days, 5 days a week. They often work 12 hours on, 12 hours off, or other variations which result in more than 40 hours of work in a typical work week. So, if the employer chooses to establish an alternate work week and overtime requirement, the employer may do so. The established work week may be 7 days to 28 days long, and overtime is not owed until more than the following number of hours are worked. For a 7-day work period, 43 hours. For a 14-day work period, 86 hours. For a 21-day work period, 128 hours. And for a 28-day work period, 171 hours. If an employer is going to establish this, they need to do so by a clear policy that sets forth what the work period is and when overtime will be paid. Firefighters. A firefighter is an individual employed by a fire department who has been trained as required by state law and who has legal authority to engage in prevention or extinguishment of fire and perform such duties. Again, if your city does not have at least 5 full-time or part-time firefighters, these employees are exempt from the overtime requirement, but not the minimum wage requirement. Please note that firefighters and law enforcement officers are measured separately. It is 5 law enforcement officers or 5 firefighters. They are not aggregated together to reach the number 5. Again, if the employer chooses to pay them overtime, that is certainly an option, but it is not required by federal law. For calculating overtime, the work week may be different from the pay period. Again, it may be 7 to 28 days long. If the employer establishes such an alternative work week, then overtime is not owed until the following number of hours are worked. A 7-day work period, 53 hours. For a 14-day work period, 106 hours. For a 21-day period, 159 hours, and for a 28-day period, 212 hours. Again, this is something that needs to be established by policy of the employer and clearly communicated to the employees.